In this lesson, madVR Labs Sammie Prescott Jr. and AV Pro's Jason Dustal will walk you through using the Calman for NV workflow. Both Sammie and Jason are industry-leading experts in video calibration, and it's a real pleasure to have them with us. You can download the Calman for NV workflow that they'll be using here for free from madvrnv.com/calibration. Note, however, you will need an active Calman license, which is available separately from portrait displays. This advanced lesson assumes you're proficient with Calman and have prior calibration experience. If not, don't worry, there's still plenty to learn here, and this information is not required to pass the Certified for NV Product Specialist Level 1 exam. So, without further ado, here's Jason and Sammie. Enjoy.
Hi there, it's Jason from AV Pro, and with me today is Sammie Prescott from madVR. Sammie, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. This will be really fun because the NV has been kind of the talk of the town for, I don't know, a couple of years now, right? And
yeah.
The big thing with the NV that I always noticed when I would go to installations to help out dealers with the install and things like that, a lot of people were using the NV for doing things like aspect ratio changes, and the HDR tone mapping obviously is very good, and just using some of those awesome features. But I think what's becoming more and more popular now, especially amongst the calibrator community, is you can actually use the NV to run a lookup table for your projector, for your display that the NV is hooked up to. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through the Calman workflow. We're going to build a lookup table for the NV. Sam is going to show us some kind of tips or tricks here. I've run through this workflow before. I think Sammie probably does it every day. And it's really straightforward. And I really got to applaud you guys because there was an NV workflow previously, and it was good, but it was kind of confusing. And, I had to print out this, long, guide that somebody had written. And this is really a much, much better way. So
this workflow was developed to be utilized with Calman to really streamline the process and give good instruction and direction as to what you select and when. Also just some really good practices to exercise when you're actually doing the calibration. It's one of the things that as more people are putting these in theaters, because there's a lot of NVs in a lot of theaters. And after the install is done, when someone wants to get it calibrated, because obviously people are using the NV for aspect ratio control, obviously it's tone mapping, now motion AI, subtitle management, all these features that it has that are great. One of the things that a lot of people are starting to take advantage of, which is great, is the calibration, because you can perform and upload massive interpolated LUTs to the NV. They'll interpolate those, create the actual 3D LUT. You can load it into the NV, and there you go.
This is really cool because what we're talking about here, guys, is all the color correction. So white balancing, the color management system in 3 dimensions. And you just cannot get this level of precision with the internal controls on the display. Sammie, if you, and I think we'll talk about this in the workflow, but what are some things that people should be doing before they get to this point? So in other words, can you just let the projector do what it's doing as is and then do all the correction? Or are there some things you have to do to the projector to get it sort of ready for the lookup table?
There are a few things that you want to do. Obviously, if you want to pair an NV with a projector, video wall, television, and not calibrate it, you completely can. But focusing in on calibration, you do want to prep the display properly before you calibrate. So one good thing to do is you want to make sure that the gamma of whatever display you're calibrating is as accurate as possible. So you wouldn't do a full calibration on, say, a projector prior to doing the auto cal and doing the LUTs within it, but you would at least want to say, okay, I'm going to send this 100% stimulus pattern, so full white or 10%, 25% window, whatever, but you want to correct your gain to D65. If you have more control within your gamma, then by all means do that, but get your gamma as flat as possible. You then want to ideally put the display in its widest available color space, but you want to do it in its native color space, right? So one mistake that a lot of people tend to make is that they might choose something like the BT 2020 picture mode or color space, and that already has correction applied to it.
Right.
So you're going to get a better result by utilizing a projector, any display, technically, its native color space. So a good example, when you do an LG and you do an auto cal on an LG, one of the first things you do is you hit the DDC reset.
Right.
What that does is that places that display into its native color space. So it doesn't have any more correction applied to it. And then when the LUT is being ran, all your measurements are being taken, is being done on top of its native color space. So that's really what you want to do. So like that would be like choosing high bright on a JDC.
It sounds like if you get the projector into a pretty good state, sort of as is, we don't want to correct something that's already been corrected. In other words, we don't want to put a LUT on top of another LUT, if that makes any sense.
Right.
So a lot of times what I see is if this doesn't happen the way you're describing it, a lot of times like the LUT will almost like overcorrect because something was so wrong. And then you end up with like banding issues in the picture and all kinds of just weird stuff because stuff was overcorrected. So for blowing the projector out to its native color gamut, mapping that down is much easier than trying to map something up if it's not set up right from the beginning, right?
Exactly.
So we want the projector to be in a pretty good state before you run the LUT with the NV, but it's not like you have to fully calibrate the projector like you would if there wasn't an NV in the system.
Yes, and that's 100% correct. Now, one thing someone could do, for instance, is say they are fine with the mapping of the gamut for the display. So say, for instance, someone's doing a Sony and they're fine with the 2020 color space within the Sony. They could just do a 1D LUT. And
just be done with it.
And just be done. Like they could just do a 1D LUT, have the colors still being corrected within the Sony based off of the color space that they chose, and then they're good to go. Or they could do a 1D plus 3D, or they can just do just a 3D by itself. So either way, you want to at least correct D65 at 100% stimulus, and then you want to put the projector in its native color space if you are doing a 1D plus 3D or a 3D only. With a 1D, you can technically use its already corrected color space if you want.
Sure.
And then after that, you just want to turn off any type of additional processing. So like the basic stuff that we normally do when we're calibrating something, right?
Yeah. I call them bonus features. Turn off all the bonus features.
Bonus
being
all that stuff off.
Does this workflow that we're going to look at today, is that already in Calman, or does somebody have to download that workflow from somewhere?
No, you actually have to download it. So let me stop sharing this page and I will share this instead. So should be seeing this now. All right, perfect. So madVR, nv.com. That's going to be your first stop for just a lot of good resources in general.
A lot of good guides in there too, like per display. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So when you come here, you just want to click on resources. It's going to scroll down towards the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
All the documentation that you really want or need is available. So say ideally when you get to a job as a calibrator, the NV should already be set up, right? The installer should have already have it all set up, done all the screen boundaries, if they're doing geometry correction, if they have an extreme, all of that should already be done.
Yeah.
But if for whatever it isn't and you're not really familiar with it, the product documentation is going to be like a gold mine effectively.
Yeah.
So you're going to have a lot of good information here in terms of like setting up nonlinear stretch, how profiles work, motion AI, and so on.
So I think I have pretty much all these printed. It just really makes it easy when you're on site.
I do this all the time. I calibrated in NV this past Sunday, and then I'm always testing and doing stuff. Sure. I have a folder with all of this stuff in here.
Yeah, right.
And we keep them up to date as well. So the Sony guide just had a revision. The Barco one just had a revision. There's going to be an Epson one coming soon.
Good. That's awesome.
There's setup devices or source device setup. So like Kaleidoscape, Apple TV, Plex, and so on. So if you're doing, say, for instance, Sony projector and you want to know how to set it up, there's information in here on how it should be set up if you're not calibrating and how you should set it up if you are calibrating. But you would go down to calibration with the NV.
Yep.
As soon as you click on this, it's going to take you to a new page. It's going to give you a lot of information, give you some, basically, the real standouts about calibrating with an NV.
Yeah.
And then down here, you will have portrait displays. And then it's free for NV Calman Workflow. You download this. Yeah, you download it. It's going to give you instructions on how to install it. Just follow the instructions, install it. And where it's going to show up is within Calman, you have a custom section.
Right.
So you do your custom section, you plug it in, or you select it from there and launch it, and you're good to go.
Cool. Easy. So there you go. Free download. Just visit the madVR website. And really, once you have the workflow installed and you can access it through Calman, you just have to pick that workflow like you would any other workflow. And then the screen you had up previously, Sammie, with Calman on it looks like really the beginning.
Yeah, it is. And one thing also that calibrators can do, because sometimes you might be in a scenario where the NV's in a rack, 2 rooms away, and they may not have the RF remote anymore, or something might happen. Either way, what they can do is they could also download the IP control utility, and this will let them connect to the NV over IP, control it with an on-screen remote. But the real benefit is that after you finish your calibration, you can download the LUTs that you loaded into the NV and save them to like that client's folder. So then when you're sending them all the reports, you can include those as well. So that way, if anything were to ever happen, they can just take those LUTs, connect to the NV, load it. It'll go right into the direct slot that it needs to be in, and they're done. So generally what I do is I'll take someone's settings file, all their LUTs, along with all the pre and post cal reports, and anything else that I am sending to them for their calibration, include it in the folder, zip it up, send it to them. And then I also have it on file, but then they have it as well. Right. And this is something that they can restore themselves. So a good example, say they have a Mark 1 and they decide, it was already calibrated and already set up. They could download those files. They decide they want to upgrade to a Mark 2. They get their Mark 2. They just upload those settings files in the LUTs, and it's like it never left.
I just want to point out one thing too. People who are watching this are probably comfortable enough with connecting their light meters and connecting the generator and that type of thing. I just wanted to point out that we're going to be using the madVR as a pattern generator. So for those of you who have like a Meridio test pattern generator, you can still use that as an external pattern generator if you'd like to, but the NV does have built-in test patterns. So if you notice on Sammie's screen, the 3 tabs across the top, he's got his colorimetry research tab. That's all ready to go. The second tab is your source, and that's the madVR generator. So we're going to use it as a generator, and we're going to use it, of course, to store the lookup tables and do all the other great things that it does. So that stuff's already done. We're just going to assume that people watching this video have already at least made it that far with Calman.
It's really important to at least understand, or depending on your meter, right? So because everyone's meter is different. So for instance, I use colorimetry research, you use a client KTNA. Yeah. With the colorimetry research, my meter syncs to the hertz or to the frequency of the display.
Oh yeah, sure.
That's why mine says 120.6 hertz. Yeah. And it's really important to have a good understanding of how the display works in terms of frame rate and the frequency, because if you have a meter that syncs to it and it's not syncing properly, it's going to throw off your readings, as well as like the verification and the post-cal, additional verifications. So it's really important to understand, like at this point, I would assume everyone knows, how their meters work and like how the display devices work. And like, if you're sending it this frame rate, this is what it's going to sync to. So like a good example, I know if I send 24 hertz to a Sony, depending on how it's set, my sync is going to be 96 hertz, right? Like that's just how they work. So if your meters sync and you're not seeing the proper sync, definitely check your settings before you start, because you don't want to go through the entire process of running a bunch of LUTs only to find out that your verification is messed up because your sync was wrong.
Yeah, and then you got to start all over. Cool. All right. Well, this is the beginning of the workflow. If you guys notice on the left side of the screen, there's what I usually call a tree view of the entire workflow. And, the first few pages we're going to see here for setup. And when it comes down to building the lookup tables, it's pretty straightforward. So let's go through it.
All right, cool. So like Jason said, first thing you would do is you want to connect your meter. You can connect both your colorimeter and your spectroradiometer. You can use the NV for the meter profiling as well, since it is just a test pattern generator. And then you are going to connect the NV as the test pattern generator. So you're basically going to do how you do all your other test pattern generators. You're going to find the source. You're going to select madVR Labs. Since I already have it connected, it's highlighted in green.
Yeah,
otherwise,
just like any other generator.
Yeah, you would choose NV, and then at the very bottom, it's going to be the IP address. You just type in the IP address, you hit connect.
Boom. And
after you do that, you have the same options for choosing if you want to do full screen, 10%, 25%, or whatever you want to select for your window size.
Sure.
You could choose the APL, disable the on-screen display text, because what happens is when you connect to the NV in the upper left corner, it will basically tell you that it's connected and like the color space it's in and whatnot. So that's pretty straightforward. There's no real surprises there. The next thing you want to do is you want to connect it as madVR VRF2. So you're basically going to find display. So this is how it's effectively going to load the LUTs into the NV itself.
Right.
And same thing, choose madVR Labs, make the proper selections, and then you choose NV, type in the IP address, connect, and you're good to go.
It's exactly like, for anyone watching this, if you've ever done a lookup table or AutoCal on an LG, it's the same thing. Find the IP address, connect it as a display. Real straightforward, easy peasy.
And next, on the first page, after the welcome, it is inputting the company info. So that you put in the calibrator's information next, and then the display and the projector information. So it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
It's just like if you're setting it up where you say start new calibration session, basically the exact same thing.
And then this is the information. Not only does it help you keep your jobs organized in an easy way, but I always I name the job, in a certain way that I can remember, because you can always go back. But all that information that you would put in on that previous screen, that shows up on the report at the end. And I always encourage the calibrators to fill that stuff out, because when you get the report at the end, it's nice and filled out. It looks nice and professional, and you can find that session again if you ever need to really easily. So I always encourage people to fill that stuff out.
And then afterwards is the hardware connect. So you can connect all the hardware from this page here. You don't have to connect it from the top tabs in the upper right.
Yeah,
I just do it from the top tabs in the upper right because I'm so used to doing it, like force of habit for doing it for so many years.
Yeah.
But you can technically connect all of this on this page.
Sure.
And there's a lot of notes. It might appear a little text heavy, but once you go through this process once or twice, you're probably not going to really be reading the text, because you don't really need to, because it is pretty streamlined. But again, it's just find my meter, use a meter profile, because sometimes you might want to. So like with my hardware, I can, for instance, use the CRI app or the colorimetry, the CR utility, create a profile with my Spectro and place it on my meter, and then I can just choose it from this drop down here.
Right.
Choose your source, choose your pattern delay. Pattern delay is pretty important. It's very important that you understand the video chain that you're calibrating to. So if someone has a lot of switches or balance, HDMI extenders, you might have to increase this, right?
Right.
It gives you a recommended of 0.5, and it will tell you, say, okay, 25% patterns is the window size, or 10% patterns for a JVC NZ series. So it gives you a few little hints here. But if you're very familiar with the video chain and the unit that you're calibrating, you should know how to set this effectively.
You mentioned that it's text heavy, and it is, but as you said, you do this a few times, and a lot of that text you don't really have to kind of read anymore. But 1,000,000%, if this is your first time going through the workflow, or even your first few times, guys, read the notes, because everything is in there that you need. But there's a lot of information here, but it's really good information. And eventually you probably will have some of it memorized, but at first, absolutely read all the notes.
Next, you are connected to the madVR F2, which is what we connected up here in the upper right. You choose the grayscale points that you want. You'll notice these green dots.
Oh yeah, the lights, yeah.
Yeah, if you're not connected to something, these dots will be red. So if I disconnect my meter, it turns red. And it's the same thing for the generator and when we're connected to the NV to be able to load LUTs. So as long as you're connected, these dots will be green.
Good point.
So find meter.
That's one of the things I really loved about this workflow is that, there are some simple tools like the lights. If you see red, you got to do something. If you see green, all good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Next, you choose your grayscale points and how many points you want to calibrate to. So unfortunately, generally with doing screen sharing like this, when there's a drop down, you don't actually see the drop down appear.
Oh yeah, it's going to be all screwy. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a technically drop down. Right now it's selecting for 21 points. I could choose 33. I could choose 44, and I could choose 65.
Yeah.
Generally, when it comes to doing like the 1D LUT, less is more. You're generally going to be better off doing like 21 or 33. Next, you choose your calibration slot that you want to create the LUT for. So in this case, right now, it's selected to BT 709, but I could choose P3. I could choose 2020.
And that's where the LUT will live on the NV, is that specifically named slot.
Exactly, yes. So say you have a projector that is capable of full BT 2020. You could do one BT 2020 LUT, and what will happen is when it receives colorimetry to say that the signal is, say, 709, it will map 709 within 2020.
Yeah.
Same thing if you do P3. It will map 709 within P3. So you can technically do one LUT if you want to.
Yeah.
Or if you want to be a little bit more meticulous and say you're targeting different luminance levels or something along those lines for different types of content, say like SDR 709.
Sure.
Then you would probably do two different slots, but you can technically just do one. And after you do that, you have NV 3D plus 1D full DDC reset. So what this does is this is going to basically load a null LUT. It's basically like importing like a Unity into that slot. So it's very important that if you're doing a calibration and they already have LUTs loaded, make sure prior to hitting this that you turn those LUTs to none and save it to base. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is it's going to wipe that slot out with that LUT
so it
selected.
Kills it anyway. Yeah, so we don't want to do that. Yeah.
And again, it says it right here. We recommend you set all LUTs to none before the session.
Yeah.
All right. And then we basically hit next. And this is where you set your targets. So generally your target is going to be D65. So 312.7, 329. You could choose a custom one. You can change it if you need to. And then you choose your color space. And you could have another chance to do the full DDC reset.
So if you for some reason didn't do it on the previous page, you can still do it on this page.
Exactly.
But there's no need to do it there and here.
Correct. Yeah. So here's another spot where the green dot comes into play. The color space that you're targeting and the LUT slot that you selected, they have to match.
Sure.
So right now my color space is set to Rec 709. The slot that I'm targeting is DCI P3. All of these are red.
Right.
As soon as I change this to DCI P3, the color space and the LUT slot match. And once it loads up, the DCI P3 indicator will turn green.
Okay, cool. Yep, just turn green. Good.
All right. And then you choose your target in terms of gamma. So it's important to understand that this is a transform. This is not HDR, right? You're doing all of this is in gamma.
Right.
So you're going to choose like say power 2.2, power 2.4. You could do 2.3, 2.6, whatever you want, but it's gamma. Now, one important thing is say you're doing a projector and you are only going to do one LUT for say P3. You actually want to make sure that you choose 2.4. So that way, when it's doing the 709 mapped within P3, the 709 is going to be displayed in 2.4. And then when it's doing like the P3 portion within HDR, it'll be handled properly for the HDR content. Once this is done, you really have nothing else to do on this page. You hit next. Now is meter positioning. This is pretty straightforward. This page exists on many workflows within Calman.
Yeah, it's very familiar.
Basically, you're displaying 100% white. You're doing a continuous read. You are making sure that your meter's positioned properly, and you're seeing how many nits it is. Once you're done, you just hit next. Next, you do the NV pre-calibration capture. And basically, this is just measuring what the projector looks like by default.
Right. Not so good.
Yeah, not so good. You hit next. This is where it's giving you a chance to adjust your D65 for 100% white. So you just measure 100%, adjust your gains, and you're done.
I'm having kind of flashbacks of some projectors in the past where if you did adjust just the gain, then like the bottom end of the grayscale would turn like yellow and just nasty. If anybody sees anything like that, like here's what I usually do. So I'll do the 100% window or test pattern like you just showed, and then I'll set the gains. And then the very next thing I do is I look at a grayscale ramp or a 16-step grayscale. And if everything is pretty flat or pretty neutral looking when I'm looking at the whole grayscale, I'm fine. Okay, I can move on to the next thing. But if I adjust the gains and now the bottom end and the middle of the grayscale are totally just whacked, what else might somebody want to try to do?
Honestly, nothing in most cases.
Okay.
So it depends on the projector or the display. And you have the option here, you have the drop down where you can check a few different other patches. So where it says 2.30, 100, like you can go, look at 20% or something like that if you want.
Yeah.
But the reason why is because depending on the projector and how they function, by changing, like say, for instance, the bias, you are impacting the contrast.
Yeah, you'll raise the floor and do all kinds of nasty stuff.
Exactly. So really, for the most part, once you set 100% white to D65, you're going to let the LUT take care of all the other adjustment.
The question I know that's going to come up, so we might as well get it out of the way now. We have not talked about adjusting brightness or contrast on the projector yet.
That is true. You would generally, that's kind of like the normal, I would assume everyone would have kind of already done that prior, but when you're setting up the projector, you want to make sure that, brightness, contrast, all of that is set properly.
Yeah.
And then go in, do your gains, check those again, and then start the process.
Well, here's why I bring it up. If you put up 100% test pattern and adjust your gains and the whole grayscale is like not so good, the contrast might be too high. You might be causing some weird color shifts. So if I see that, I might turn the contrast down, one click at a time until the 16-step grayscale pattern looks neutral. And then I can feel safer doing this.
That's a good point, because if contrast is too high outside of potential clipping, a lot of displays actually do have a shift throughout the grayscale.
Right. Yeah. I've seen it
so like
sometimes,
if you turn up contrast too much, you might get like a green bias, like a shift across the entire image. So you want to make sure that that's set up properly. Now, in some cases as well, you can turn up the contrast to get more brightness out of the unit, depending on what it is. So turning up the contrast is not necessarily bad. It's just, again, this is where it comes down to how familiar are you with said unit you're working on and how it behaves with these controls. Right. Because you still have to know how the projector works.
Sure.
Like you can't set it up incorrectly and then try to have the NV fix everything. I mean, you can, but you shouldn't, right? You should set it up properly to start. So in some cases, you can turn the contrast up, but turning the contrast up and using it in an NV does not mean that you can turn the contrast up on that particular same projector,
right,
when you're not using something like an NV, right? So,
and we also have to think about, I mean, there's so many variables, right? Like screen material, screen size, room lighting, so you can't just assume, oh, I'm going to put every Sony at 99 or, whatever. I'm going to peg every Sony or every JV. You can't just with projectors, you can't just like give these blanket universal settings or universal ideas, if you will. If you do contrast at 100 and then you go to the next job and it's the same projector, but different screen, you set the contrast to 100, it's going to be totally different. So as Sammie said, and I 100% agree with him, understand the system and understand the display you're working on. And if you have a better understanding of that display and how the system works, then this is so much easier to deal with.
Yeah, because that is one thing that a mistake that some people make is they have the assumption that everything is setting the 2-point, doing, your gain and your bias.
Right.
And that's not true. Like that's not how things work.
Right. There's a flat panel out there, and if you have the contrast at 100, it's clipped to death. And you come down to 99, it's perfect. It's like, why not just make 99 100?
Right.
But that's the point, right? Like, understand how your display works. And when you get to this color correction and building the lookup tables, your life will be much easier. Trust me, you don't want to do it and then see something wrong and then have to start over. And we've all been there, we've all done it, but let's try to avoid that if we can.
The next page, very simple. Whatever your max luminance is for your nits, you just plug that number in here. So if it were, in this case, it's 96. I just type in 96, hit the check mark. It loads it into the NV for the peak luminance section.
Right.
And that's what the tone mapping is used to determine.
I cannot reiterate how important it is to get this correct. But the numbers right there in the bottom left of the screen, you can't really, kind of hard to miss.
Yeah, you can't really miss it. Yeah, and you have your patterns here, right? So you just hit read series. It's going to measure white. It's going to measure black. If it's something, for instance, say it's a projector where it does any type of like PWM and it like kind of ramps up and then it settles, or it might pulse and it's too bright and then it drops down to what is actually stable. Again, this is just knowing how what you're working on actually works.
Yeah.
So you can choose to hit 100% white and just do a continuous measurement. So you get your number, plug it in, hit the check mark.
Yeah.
After you do that, you could type in the calibration name. So we could say Jason and Sammie video, right? And then we hit the check mark, and that is what that particular LUT that you are going to load for this session is going to be named.
I always encourage people, and even when they're naming the calibration session in general, make it easy. You don't want to dig through the menu, and you don't want to name this, let's just say P3, when there's already a P3 memory, because now you're not going to remember which one it was. So Sammie had a good one right there. He just put our names down. I'll usually, whatever LUT I'm building, let's just say P3, and then I'll put like JD after it, so I know that one's mine. So when I'm going through the NV menu, it's very easy to tell which one's mine and which ones were pre-installed from the factory.
Right. So I would do something similar to like SP P3 LUT, and then
you put the date in there. Yeah, it's a great way to do it too. Sure.
Don't
forget to check the box.
Yep, you have to check the box, and then you're good to go.
Cool.
And then you hit next. And at this point, this is where you're going to actually start the calibration process. So you have where you can do a 1D LUT only, and it's giving you information. Again, definitely read what's on the page. Like, it's giving you information saying like, it doesn't do a full calibration of 1. This is only doing a 1D LUT, which is your grayscale and your gamma. But you could do 1D only. You could do 1D plus 3D, which is more standard.
Sure.
Or you could do 3D only. So this is where it's somewhat expected that if you're running LUTs, that you don't have to be a full-on 100% professional calibrator You don't have to fully have a super tight grasp on color science. If you do, it makes it so much easier.
Sure.
But you should have an understanding of what LUTs are, how they work, and what you're doing if you're choosing, say, 1D only, or if you're choosing 3D only. So a good example, if you're doing 1D only, you're only doing the grayscale. And how we used the example earlier, you can then let the Sony, if you're doing a Sony, use its 2020 color space, because you're not going to correct it.
Right.
But if you're correcting, you're doing a 1D plus 3D, right? Then you would choose, you're doing the 1D, you're doing the gamma, and then you're going to do like a native color space, right? So you're not applying correction on top of something that's already corrected. Or if you're doing 3D only, you should understand that the 3D has a 1D in it already, right? And it's going to have that uploaded to that slot, but it's only doing a 3D. So it's not doing a 1D pass.
Yeah.
And then not touching the 1D that's in the 3D, because all 3Ds have a 1D.
Sure.
Right. So this is where you should have a good understanding of what you're selecting. And again, you have notes on the side. Definitely read them. So in this example, I'm just going to choose 1D plus 3D. So here you run the 1D. The levels is always going to be 0 to 255, so PC level. In this example, I chose 33 points for the 1D LUT. Come down here, you hit the little auto cal button, you let it run.
There's a this kind of threw me off for a second the first time I saw it. I'm like, interesting, we're doing 0 to 255, right? But remember, we're trying to open up the projector as much as possible and letting the madVR do all the processing. So if we're doing it in 0 to 255, the whole range is calibrated.
Correct. And then when it's displaying video, it's going to be doing it in video levels for 255. Yeah.
Right. But we're calibrating 0 to 255 because we're calibrating everything in the projector. Its widest color gamut, its biggest dynamic range. You know, we want that projector to be a really, really bright, good light bulb, basically.
Yeah. And I'm going to see if this opens up. Yeah, it doesn't open up, unfortunately. So basically what happens when you click the little auto cal button, you get a pop-up window.
Yeah.
That pop-up window is going to ask you how many active grayscale points you want to calibrate. So in this case, I did 33. And then it's going to ask you what your delta E target is. So on this one, I didn't even choose anything crazy, right? I think I chose like 0.7 just for, because this was a test one. That I was doing, but I think I chose like 0.7.
Yeah.
And my average is still 0.5.
It's less, yeah.
My max is 1.1. If you wanted to, you could technically go like 0.2, 0.3. I find that if you're going to do it, choosing something like 0.3 is pretty good. You don't want to go too crazy, because at that point, it's just going to increase the amount of time for possibly very small gains.
I had a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours one time, he said, set it to 0. I was like, really? He's like, just set it to 0 and it'll just keep pounding away until it kind of just gives up. I tried it. It took so much extra time. It kind of wasn't worth it. But, and what we can do too is the way that the screen capture software works, it's kind of weird because we can't see that pop up that you're talking about. But if you want to take maybe a screenshot of that pop up, we can insert it later so everybody can see it.
Yeah, we could definitely do that. So next,
and that looks fantastic, by the way.
That's
very
definitely
good,
not bad.
Good results.
It's not a bad result by any means.
Right.
So then you hit next, you proceed to the next page. This page is very important. Make sure you read this stuff.
Yeah, this is
like
a good
all
one,
of this stuff here, make sure you read it.
Right.
Because what you have to do is you want to enable the 3D LUT. So you want to, again, you're not going to actually see the drop. Oh, you did see the drop down.
So that one we can see, which is kind of weird, but okay.
So very first one says, as you've just generated a 1D LUT, click on the madVR generator, which is what I'm in right now, and make sure you click enable 3D LUT.
Yes. Do not miss that.
Do not miss it. And one thing that I like to do, just to make sure that it was loaded, is I'll check it. I'll uncheck it, and then I'll check it again just to make sure.
Oh, you're like being super thorough, like super cautious. Yeah, I don't blame you. I would do the same thing. Yeah.
And one thing you'll notice is that when you check it, if you're looking at the screen and then you uncheck it, you will see it change. You'll see the LUT actually
totally. Yeah. Right.
And then check it again, and then you're good to go. So this checkbox needs to be checked.
Yeah.
Now this is for this scenario of doing the 1D plus 3D.
Right.
And other scenarios, you're going to leave it unchecked, right? So now that's checked. I hit the auto cal button. Again, it pops up a screen that you can't see, but I'll take a screenshot of it and we'll insert it into the video. You choose your delay, which has already been set on the very first page. So in this case, it had it set to 0.75. You could add a start delay. So say, for instance, you want to put a start delay in because you might run a massive LUT and you want to leave the room, but you can't start it right away because the door opening, right? So you could put in a start delay if you need to, so that way it'll give you time to leave the room. And
I see that. Honestly, I see that as an important feature because there's times where I'll be in a dedicated theater where it is pitch black, and I'm going to run a bigger LUT, so I know it's going to take at least 10 minutes or so. I'll set the delay time for 60 seconds and hit go, and I have 60 seconds to get out of the room and shut the door. And then I come back, 20 minutes later and it's done. But I know for sure, we have some friends that do a lot of calibration work in some studios, and they do this all the time. If they're doing a gigantic LUT and they're going to let it run overnight, put in a delay, open the door, close the door, come in the morning, it's done, and there was no worry at all about ambient light or anything that would throw off the readings. I think it's a cool feature if you're not going to sit there in the room while it's running.
Exactly. The next option is right underneath that. There's a checkbox, and again, very important that you read this page.
Yeah.
It says mandatory setting. Set the 3D
mandatory
scale to Unity. This option has to be checked. So
I love how it's like bold and underlined, and it's like don't miss this part.
So you basically check that box.
Yeah.
All right. So that's the if you don't get anything else from this page or this portion, make sure that you pick up and get set 3D grayscale to Unity. Then you choose your calibration type. So what I find is you could choose like fixed grid. So like, a 9x3. So like the fixed grid 9, 13, 17, 21. Sometimes less is more, right?
Yes, I noticed that too.
Doing a 21-point cube, your results may not be that much better than if you had done a 13-point cube, right? Yeah. I always try to hover around 13. You could do like 17 as well. So it's your preference, and again, knowing how the display works, because as you keep measuring, you are creating heat. Heat creates drift
problems, and
right. So just choose the appropriate option for what you're working on and what the displays can handle and is capable of.
Yeah.
So in this case, I would say I'm going to choose a fixed 13. And then at that point, you just hit OK. It's going to run through all the patches. How Calman works is after it measures all of the patches that comes up, it will complete the LUT, but then it will actually have to compute the LUT. Right. So the computation can take a varying amount of time. Sometimes it's super quick. Sometimes it could take longer. Even if you have more points, it could still take a good amount of time. So depending on the version of Calman that you're on, if you see it sitting there for saying like LUT compute for 20, 30, maybe depending on what it is, 35 minutes, don't freak out. It's still working. It's still running. That's not an NV thing. That's more of like a Calman and how it computes. So just be patient and let it run.
When I talk to people about how many points to run for the lookup table, I always tell them, like, it's just like anything else. If you're telling a story to your friend, the more information that it has to work with, the better it is. So if you run a LUT that's 6 points, and you're expecting those 6 points to map out for like a test you're running right here, not so good. But it does get to a point of diminishing returns. And I'll tell you my TV at home, the difference between a 13 and a 17 was like minimal, but it took so much longer in time. So
Exactly.
I don't want to run a really small one unless things are already pretty tight as they are anyway. But I also don't want to run a giant one anyway. I know you said you like to do 13. I like to hover around 9 maybe and just kind of see what the results look like after that. But the more points you read, the more information it has to compute with and to work with, the better off you are. Whichever cube it is, it comes out to about 3,500 points. That for me was kind of like the sweet spot. And, with my meter, it's a little bit faster. And I want to say it took like a little over an hour, like maybe an hour 10 to do 3,000 points or so, 3,500 points, whatever it is.
That's probably going to be a 17, because if you
Yeah.
do a fixed 13, that's going to be around a little over 2,000 points.
Yeah.
But if you do a 17, that's going to be closer to like 4,000 points.
By 17. Yeah, 4913. That's what it
Yeah.
was. So the 13 to the 17 in my scenario, it didn't really make the graphs any better or anything like that. So I know now on that TV, the 13's enough. But this is what Sammy and I are talking about, is know your display, and it'll help you in the long run.
Right. And the idea is that no one that's doing calibration professionally should be trying to go in and do it as quick as possible to knock them out. Like, people ideally shouldn't be going in and say like, oh, I'm just gonna, hit it with a 2-point and, call it a day.
Right.
There are times where that's kind of what you can do based off of the display that you're working on. But for the most part, you want to go for maximum like accuracy,
right,
while being efficient. Again, know what your display can do, understand your timeline, just make good choices.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And this is the post cal, just like you see any other Calman user sees when they finish the calibration. You run the post cal scan so you can compare that to the pre cal. And Sammy, this looks pretty fantastic.
Yeah, and like you, again, knowing how the display works, you'll know that with this particular model, it cannot hit fully 100% saturated red. It also cannot hit fully 100% saturated green unless you're using a filter. But then, because this is an NZ8, but if you do that, then you're losing 36% of your light.
You cut a lot of light.
Right. So knowing how it works, you can again make a decision based off of, because a lot of what this is saying, going into a room and saying, okay, he has this size screen, he's at this throw, he needs light more than anything.
Right.
Versus, okay, he's only 13 feet away, the screen is 10 inches or 105 inches. He could use the filter and it's still going to be super bright for him.
Totally. Absolutely.
So again, just knowing kind of like what the room is, what they value, because sometimes they might want less light, and they would be okay with like, hey, I'm fine with a better gamut coverage versus more light is going to give me a better picture. So seeing what they want, seeing what the room is like, and picking what's going to make the most sense. So in my case, a 3.2 is not bad, right? That's right for a max. And if you look at the actual sweeps, 10% sweeps in CIE 76, like everything's pretty dialed in except for these 2 points right here, and obviously green.
Right.
So then you can look and you can see, what does the gamut look like? Pretty low.
Yeah, you can't really complain about that.
Yeah, at a 0.002 minimum like luminance for black.
Well within spec.
Yeah. So once you're done with that, you hit next. It takes you to the verification page.
Yeah.
You'll see the after and you see the before. Actually, in another update, these were switched, but same thing. It's after for grayscale, after for gamut. 1.2 max, 1.7 max. This is when I ran additional verification. So before you generate your report, if you want the additional verification to populate in there, do additional verification or additional validation. I'm sorry. So we're going to click on this. And I ran a pretty nice size color checker.
Yeah.
And again, anyone familiar with Calman, you'll know that nothing should exist near red. Green or yellow is a delta error of 3. Green is a delta error of 1 or less. Pretty good.
Pretty good.
ITP's a little high, but again, it's a projector.
Yeah.
So you can only expect so much. Now, if you were pairing this with, say, a direct view display, such as like a QD OLED, your ITP is going to be super low.
Right.
And then you also have saturation sweeps.
Yeah.
So in this case, I only did 20% sweeps, but you can choose to do 5% sweeps.
Sure.
10% sweeps.
You're probably like me, where like if I'm more or less like evaluating a display or one that I've never worked on before, I like to do 5%, because that kind of shows me like a zoomed in version of what's really going on.
Right.
Probably a little overkill for most instances, but this for me would be more of like hey, you just got this new TV, you don't really know it yet. I like to just really beat it up and run the most difficult tests I can, because I can see where the display is sort of deficient, and then that helps me do the calibration. So again, we've said this multiple times, know the display.
And if you want to provide, 5% sweeps, you can.
Sure.
You could say, I want to see how it maps 709 within 2020 or within P3. Now, since I didn't do 709 within P3 on this, there's no actual measurement data.
Right.
But if I did, it would be there.
Right.
And then once you go to AutoCal Complete again, then you can hit save and report. You save it as a session. After you save it as a session, the report will generate. Save that and send it to the client.
Yep. And we'll show a screenshot of the of what the report looks like too, so people can kind of see it. But it's like a lot of the other reports. You have a before and an after, and your information's on the report, customers' information's on the report. There's a notes field if you wanted to add some additional notes. One thing I always recommend to people, this doesn't talk at all about like the sharpness control and just other little bits and pieces that don't have anything to do with color. So I always tell people, anything that you do that you feel like you need to document, just put that in the notes section, because that ends up on the report. And if you're giving the client the report with any additional settings, plus what you pointed out before, Sammie, with the saved file for the madVR, if something ever happens, then if it's not me going back to the customer's house, somebody can look at my notes, they can look at my files, they can load the LUT back into the NV, and it's back to when I had left it previously. So
Exactly.
I like to document sort of everything, but that's just me. Oh, there's a report.
Yeah.
You have a report right there. Good.
Yeah. So like this is a report, but you can, put your grids on here. You can put your target points. So like you could have like the red, green. You can change this to be columns. You could have it a line.
Yeah. You can do whatever.
Basically how the normal Calman reports work. Yeah. Here's the color checker and how it appears on there. Here's the saturation sweeps.
That looks awesome.
Yeah, so you can have like a full report.
Yeah.
You could have notes. You could put the serial number on there. Just generally like how all the other Calman reports work.
Yeah, cool, good. And guys, that's it. The workflow. It's, I don't know, what is that? Maybe however many pages it is. The first half of those pages are just getting everything set up correctly and giving you instructions on what to do and that type of thing. If you guys notice, when we were actually making measurements to build the LUT, that was what, like 3 pages maybe. So, once you do this a few times and you get really proficient at it, you're probably going to be able to skip a lot of those early pages in the workflow.
All my hardware's connected by the time I started.
Yeah.
My calibration targets, it's only like checking 2 checkboxes really, or not checkboxes, drop downs.
Sure.
Meter positioning, I already know how to position my meter.
Yeah.
So I don't really have to worry about that.
Yeah.
The pre-cal capture, I'm going to run that anyways because you need the data to compare it against. At that point, I've already set my white point generally because I already do all that stuff beforehand. Max luminance, as soon as I already know what it is, I plug it in, send it along with the LUT name. I choose 1D plus 3D, and it's just 2 pages really for the most
just
part.
Run it.
After that, you just do the post-cal capture and any additional verification. That's it.
Yeah.
It's not really that in depth. Once you go through it a few times, again, the first few times, definitely read everything. But after you go through it a few times, it's really simple. Like it's not difficult at all.
Right. No, that's cool. That's really good. Well, Sammie, gosh, I think that kind of wraps it up. Even explaining it and all that other stuff, it didn't take us a lot of time. And everybody works a little bit differently and stuff, but just in my experience so far, between doing the initial NV setup stuff, screen boundaries and the things you mentioned before, and then depending on how big I make the lookup table for the NV, I might be in and out of this job in an hour, 90 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
And that's if I'm, and a lot of times, a lot of calibrators like to chit chat with the client, or if the integrator's there, they like to show them some really cool things. And, so a lot of times I'll book one of these for like 2 hours to give myself a little bit of extra time. But man, those days of like 4 and 5 hour calibrations, I think are behind us because of stuff like this.
Yeah. And it depends on like some of what you do prior. Yeah. So like if, for instance, I'm going to do with certain projectors, I might upload to the projector to fix the gamma, like a custom 1D LUT to that projector itself.
Yeah.
That'll take a little bit of time. And then if I actually have to go through the NV and make a few changes, just because sometimes like someone might install it and they may not have set up nonlinear stretch for them, or stuff like that, or I can kind of tweak it a little bit with geometry correction. I might do that. But if you're going in and you're doing one LUT, and especially if you're doing like a 21 for the 1D and like a 9 for the 3D, you're going to be in and out.
Yeah, right.
That's not going to take you really any time at all.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Sammie, I think that's it, man. Pretty straightforward. Excellent work on the workflow and all those guides and things. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. And I don't have anything else, man. That looks good.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Cool. We'll talk later.